I'm going to show you how to produce music 10 times faster. I'll be covering a few topics in here, but mainly I'm going to show you what I use for my general template, which saves me so much time every time I work on music. There'll also be some other workflow tips thrown in here. So make sure to subscribe to the channel and let's go ahead and get started. So first I'm going to show you my template that I use in all my music that I'm writing. It's a huge time saver because the project already has a lot of the things that I know I'm going to be using in my track anyways, which saves me tons of time. So I'm going to go through and show you the template. And lastly, you can download the template files for both Ableton Live 10 and Ableton Live 11 versions in the link in the description below. Let's jump in. So this is my template. It starts at the top with some references. I have kick, bass, drums, synths, effects, and then resampling. So I'm going to briefly go over all these different groups that I have. First is the references, and I have 3 audio tracks here, which are just a great way for me to throw in some of my favorite tracks or maybe some of the older tracks that I've written to influence what I'm writing and to keep me on track to stay within the ideas that I want to start writing with. This is also great for when you go down to your mix downs, that you'll have these reference tracks ready to balance your mix against. So first tip is going to be swapping between multiple channels so you can reference different things or turn off and on different things to test them. So to do this, you right click and you edit key map, and then you can choose whichever key that you would like. So if you want to choose the O key, press O, and here you go, O3. This little symbol, whatever that is. And then you press escape. And now when I click this, press that button and it switches back and forth. You can do this with basically anything inside of Ableton, which is another huge time saver. And you can route it to multiple things. So if I want to solo just my kick and my bass, I can right click, edit key map, and I can type in, let's say, the symbol here. That's going to solo and cue the bass mixer, but it's also going to solo the kick. So when I press that button, it solos the kick and bass, and then I press it again, it unsolos and lets everything play. Next, I have my kick channel, and inside my kick channel, I have 3 layers: the high, the mid, and the low. I already have some EQing on there for the highs and the mids. On the channel itself, I have a drum bus with 20% dry wet. The drum bus is great because it limits and it really adds a lot of power to your kicks, but I find that sometimes it's a little bit too aggressive, so I just have 20%. EQ, multi-band compression, some more compression, and then an EQ at the very end of the chain. And then I have the MIDI already drawn out for the kicks. Again, it just saves a few seconds drawing out the MIDI in this template, but I know that the MIDI for my kick is going to look like this, so why not? Next, I have my sidechain channel, also referred to as ghost sidechain or ghost kick. It's just a sidechain channel that is separate from the kick, so if I make any changes to the kick drum or I turn down the volume in the kick drum during the track, then it doesn't affect the actual sidechain compression that I have going on. So I'll route most of everything into the sidechain channel instead of the kick, unless there's another reason why I would specifically want a sidechain only from the kick. Moving on to the bass group, I have EQ, multi-band compression, and then of course my sidechain compression. I'm only doing a light sidechain on this bass group because I'm doing a much harder sidechain on the subgroup specifically. This one here is just to kind of glue all the sidechain elements together as it's getting squished, and the sub is where a lot of the major sidechain compression is actually going on. And then I'm just loading into these different channels just the instrument with some EQ and compression, and then on the actual sub I have an amp, which is just a light saturator, and then I have this EQ actually cutting out a little bit of that saturation and warmth that it brings. Just by adding these things that I know I'm going to be using in every track, I'm saving a few seconds on a lot of different steps, and it adds up. So if you prefer using Diva or Serum or whatever synth you want, you can actually just load these up so that when you open your project, you already have them ready to go. Maybe even if you want to have your favorite preset loaded up that you like to write with. But I would suggest not using the same sounds every time or using the same MIDI or same instruments. Otherwise, a lot of your stuff might start to sound the same. So it's good to have these at the start, but it's also good to kind of push yourself and try to use different sounds. So what I actually do to make sure that I don't reuse the same instruments every time is I actually use poor quality samples. So diving into the drums now, the MIDI already laid out for some of my instruments that I know I'm going to be using, but the samples that I've chosen in these drum racks aren't ones that I would leave in the track. So they don't really sound great for my style of music, so I know that I'm forced to change them. What some people do is actually load in a bunch of different samples into their drum racks of all their favorite samples, and then just cycle through those and have a select few samples that they use. So I'm not going to go through every single instrument because they're basically all the same. It's just an instrument that I choose and then some effects and processing that I use, EQ and compression on every single channel, and then some other things that I might use. Like for example, my clap, I use a saturator on basically every one of my claps. So I want to use a saturator in my template. You don't want to be stuck using the same sounds every single time that you are writing music. So try changing the different synths and presets that you're using and not just relying on the same ones. So for my synths, I just have some sidechain compression on the group, and then I have my different instruments in here. The one thing I do have is in my main melody, I have the simplest piano just so I can write melodies very quickly and very easily. And I'm not grabbing a synth every single time. It just kind of helps me write out some ideas that I have. Maybe you'd prefer to use your favorite lead sound or an ARP sound or something, but it's good just to have an instrument loaded up. You can just start writing ideas right away. I have space for a vocal in case I want to use a vocal. And then I have my effects group and the resamplings. There's also this cool white noise generator down here. I won't go over how to make it, but basically it just makes white noise so I can automate the volume so that I have white noise whenever I want in the track. That will be available in the downloads. If you want this white noise generator, just go ahead and download the project in the link in the description below. Almost forgot about the send and return tracks. So I have 4 return tracks here. I have a drum reverb, so I'll just be sending the drums into those return tracks individually. For my drum reverb, I also have a long reverb, and then I have an FX send. So the FX send is going to have a much longer delay feedback, and I'm cutting out some of the low end, and then I have a reverb on that as well with a really long decay time. This is for like big splash effects, impacts, white noises, things like that, so that they have this big kind of delay and reverb on them so that I'm not adding a reverb and delay onto every single one of my impact sounds or tracks that I have. Lastly, I have the New York compression, and the New York compression is also called parallel compression. It's basically just a really squished compressor. If I push my drums into this, it's going to get just an absolutely destroyed signal. You can see it's compressing so much, and then I'm turning the gain back up. This is a whole different topic to talk about, but I do use parallel compression in a lot of my tracks, so I have a return track already set up for that so that I don't have to redo it every single time. I will usually add another return track here or there, but this is just a great starting point just to save me some time. So now that you have your template and you can open this up, and every track that you start writing on, it's gonna save you a ton of time. So there's a couple other things I wanna show you as well that'll also save you some time. So another thing that we can do is actually use loops to help us write music. And I know a lot of people shy away from loops, myself included. For a long time, I completely ignored using drum loops, but sometimes using loops is a great way to speed up the writing process and get ideas flowing. I don't think you should rely on loops. I don't think that you should really use melody loops in the sense of just taking the melodies that are written, but getting ideas from them and using them in ways to elevate your track, I think is totally fine as long as you're writing the majority of the music, especially the melodies, and just using these loops as a way to kind of increase the overall quality or maybe add in a little bit of pizzazz. I specifically have places inside of my template that I leave open for audio in case I want to use some sort of percussion loop or something. By the way, I actually do have music production courses and music production coaching. A lot of people have been telling me that they don't know I offer this, so I wanted to put it into the video as well. If you're looking to up your music production game with music production coaching or music production courses, then check the description below where I have more information. Lastly, I have something on my master chain. So I have a mixing rack. This is the one in Ableton Live 10, but I'm going to show you the one in Ableton Live 11 because it looks nicer and it's a little bit better. So here I have what I call my mixing rack, but what Ableton 11 has is a screenshot feature where I can set different settings here and then make a screenshot of it so I can actually just quickly jump to those settings. And it has the different screenshots. So I have null, which just means there's no processing on it. And then I have ear save. This is a way to reduce the ear fatigue that we get from listening to loud music or listening to any sounds for a long period of time. This is just set up in a way that I have this mapped. So when I click on this screenshot, it's going to bring down the bass a little bit and bring down the high end a little bit. I can click new. I can name this mid cut. I can set up my frequencies, bring that frequency over. I can bring up the quality quite a bit, so it's pulling out a lot of that mid frequency. I can go back to null or ear save, and then I can go down to my mid cut and it will save the settings that I have there. It does take a little bit of fine tuning to get all the different snapshots right, but it's super helpful. Next, I have this utility where I can just test the track in mono and turn up and down the gain. And then I have a limiter on there because I like to write with a limiter on. And then I have free plugins at the end here. I have Ulean loudness meter and Span, which is a spectrum analyzer. You can get both of those in the links in the description below. They're great tools and they're absolutely free. Another great time saver is default track settings or default preset settings. So I can actually right click and insert an audio track or a MIDI track. And before adding anything else, I already have an EQ and a compressor on there. So what this means is that when you actually load in a new MIDI or audio track, it will already have predetermined effects or settings that you apply and then save. So if I right click and insert a MIDI track, I can see that I already have an EQ and a compressor before I've even added anything from the effects. If I try this on my audio, I don't actually have anything. So let's go ahead and add an EQ. I'll add the compressor and maybe I'll add a reverb as well. Then what you want to do is right click on the channel that you want as your default audio track, save as default audio track, and now, do you want to overwrite? Yes. And now when I bring in my next audio track, it will already have these settings. You can do this to your settings as well. For example, I like using drum bus, but as I mentioned, it comes in a little bit hot, so I can just go ahead and grab a drum bus. You see how the drive is already at 20%, the dry wet's 100%, and the dampening is at 9.2. I want to have the drive at 0, the dampening all the way up, and the dry wet down to around 20%. Instead of doing this every time, I can just right click and save as default preset. Now, when I load in the drum bus onto any channel, it's going to have those settings already started for me. It can take time to set these up, but instead of setting them up individually, the next time that you're writing a track and you make these settings and you're happy with them, just save them as your default preset, and it takes 2 seconds. The same goes for saving presets. If you like the settings of this reverb and you don't want it to be the default, meaning that it's gonna come in the same every single time that you load it in, you can just click this save up here and save this as good reverb for drums, for example. And now every time that you want to grab a good reverb for drums, you can just grab that and throw that in, and you have the settings there. I have 2 more tips for you, and they're also huge time savers. Stripping back your completed tracks. So this track I have is basically done, and instead of starting from a completely new project, I can save this as a new file, take all the main ideas of this track and completely get rid of them, and just focus on the MIDI and samples and swapping out all those that they sound different, but using the same structure, leaving in some of the processing so that I can just fine tune them and tweak them instead of having to completely start over. Of course, this can lead to you sounding a little bit too similar if you're not removing too many of the elements. Make sure that if you use this approach, you're really stripping down to the very, very foundation of the track, and you're not using too many elements of the old track. This is just to save you time in doing the things that you'd be doing anyways in the new track, not just using your old track to kind of remake a new track using the same ideas and elements. I hope that makes sense. My final tip is to get your arrangement sorted. So if you look at this arrangement right here, I have 2 different versions of the main arrangement, details and sub arrangement. So just a bunch of information that you can use as part of your template to really speed up the process and help you arrange and finish your songs. So to make an arrangement template like this, I actually have a video covering this topic, which you can watch right here.